Sometimes, the foods we love can reveal surprising stories about our past. In the 1970s, people in the United States ate things that might sound bizarre or even unsafe by today's standards. Government regulations were different, and less was known about certain health risks. Families happily served dishes that would raise eyebrows now, and old TV commercials promoted products that have since disappeared from store shelves. Exploring the reasons behind these vanished flavors and ingredients tells us a lot about how times have changed and why certain once normal foods are now illegal to eat. Number 1. Sassafras root beer. Back in the 1970s, many families across America enjoyed a homemade root beer brewed with real sassafras. People remember their grandparents steeping sassafras bark or roots to make that distinctively aromatic drink. It was a common sight at neighborhood cookouts, where everyone lined up to try the fresh batch. At that time, the Food and Drug Administration had not yet banned sassafras oil containing saffrole, which later became a major health concern. By the late 1970s, more and more articles began drawing connections between saffrole and potential health risks. Manufacturers had to respond quickly, and suddenly that old-fashioned root beer, so common in earlier decades, became difficult to find. Older folks who grew up in the 1930s or 1940s sometimes talk about how their own parents made sassafras tea as a folk remedy. In those days, it was just part of daily life, and no one suspected it would eventually vanish from grocery aisles. But after reading dozens of studies online and combing through stacks of articles, it's clear that the government took the health concerns seriously, so sassafras-based beverages basically disappeared. Baby boomers can recall a time when local drugstores sold small kits to brew your own root beer. The promotional commercials on TV portrayed it as a fun family project. Kids, now part of Gen X, would hold up the glass bottles proudly. Today, sassafras root beer still sparks nostalgia for that golden age of small-town America, with its old diner counters, rock and roll tunes on the radio, and a vibe that only the 1970s could offer. But actual sassafras oil is banned for commercial food use now. Some novelty shops sell sassafras-flavored syrups that don't contain the real thing. It's a tiny remnant of that long-lost time, a flavor that baby boomers remember fondly, even if it's no longer legal to sell authentic saffron-laden drinks in the United States. Number 2. Cyclamate sweeteners. During the 1970s, sugary treats were huge in the American diet, but there was also a growing demand for low-calorie products. Cyclamate sweeteners, discovered a few decades prior, became popular in sodas, candy, and even some snack bars. People from the 1950s and 1960s can recall how these sweeteners were initially marketed as a safer alternative to sugar for those who wanted to slim down without losing sweetness. Old commercials from that era played up the convenience, with catchy jingles that promised all the flavor of regular soda with half the guilt. Many baby boomers were introduced to Cyclamate sweetened drinks as teenagers, especially once diets and fitness started gaining attention in the late 1960s and early 1970s. By analyzing a range of archived magazine ads and historical diet guides, it's clear that cyclamates were once everywhere. However, scientific concerns over its potential link to health issues caused the FDA to ban it in the United States in 1969. Although some products continued to appear on shelves for a short while into the early 1970s due to stock leftovers. Many countries outside the US still allow cyclamates, but inside the States it was phased out quickly, leaving people who'd grown attached to that sweet flavor somewhat disappointed. Retro cookbooks from the era sometimes mention substituting saccharin for cyclamate, and those published just after the ban often included disclaimers about where to find safe sweeteners. This shift reflected a broader change in food regulations, as Americans began paying closer attention to what they were consuming. In modern times, other sugar substitutes like sucralose and stevia have taken over, so younger generations might not even realize cyclamate was once a key ingredient in classic sodas. But for those who remember that old sweetener, it's another piece of 1970s culture that got lost in the shuffle as new regulations kicked in. Number 3. Real turtle soup. Turtle soup has a long history in American cuisine, particularly around coastal regions and in certain pockets of the country where old-fashioned recipes were passed down through generations. In the 1970s, it was still served at some upscale restaurants and even in home kitchens, especially among families who clung to traditional recipes from the 1930s or 1940s. Some older cookbooks featured step-by-step guides for preparing snapping turtle or sea turtle, which was at one point viewed as a delicacy, promotional materials from earlier decades advertised canned turtle soup, highlighting it as a gourmet treat. Ads in vintage magazines showed elegant dinner parties serving turtle soup as the opening course to a fancy meal. During that era, fewer regulations protected certain turtle species. Over time, as the public became more conscious of endangered wildlife and the ecological impact of over-harvesting, laws changed. By the late 1970s, the Endangered Species Act and related conservation efforts severely restricted the hunting or commercial sale of many turtle species. Modern references indicate that genuine turtle soup is no longer legal if it involves certain protected turtles, and the few places that attempt to replicate the taste might use farm-raised or entirely different meats. Online discussions and old photo albums sometimes turn up images of large family gatherings featuring a giant pot of turtle stew set against a backdrop of 1970s decor. Baby boomers who grew up in that time may recall the unique taste, describing it as somewhat similar to chicken or veal, but with a heavier texture. Although it seems strange to younger generations, it was normal enough back then to see turtle soup on a wedding banquet menu, or to hear about older relatives cooking it for Sunday dinner. Now, it's practically vanished from mainstream American cuisine because of legal restrictions, leaving only nostalgic memories for those who loved it decades ago. Number 4, red dye number 2, candies. The 1970s saw a wave of bright, colorful confections in candy stores and supermarkets. Neon orange slices, hot pink gumdrops, and vivid red licorice ropes were popular among kids. Red dye number 2, amaranth, was at the center of that color craze, showing up in cereals, sodas, ice creams, and, of course, candy. People who were children in the 1950s or 1960s had grown used to food coloring in practically everything, but the 1970s took it to a new level, with wild, almost fluorescent shades that made treats look extra appetizing. Television ads targeted baby boomers buying candy for their kids, and the packaging often emphasized the bold flavors and intense colors, highlighting that sense of retro fun. However, research started emerging that connected red dye number 2 to potential health risks, including concerns about possible carcinogenic effects. By 1976, the FDA banned red dye number 2 in the United States. It was a big deal in the food industry, and manufacturers had to scramble to reformulate their products. Looking through old newspaper articles and scientific reports from that period, it's apparent that the dye's prohibition was a controversial topic, with some calling it alarmist, while others believed it was a crucial step to protect public health. Parents who once handed out shiny red candies at Halloween had to adjust to new color variations, sometimes noticing the reds weren't quite as vibrant anymore. Retro candy collectors and nostalgia enthusiasts still talk about the distinctive look of sweets with red dye number 2, reminiscing about a time when checking ingredient lists wasn't really part of everyday life. For many, that bright candy represents a piece of American nostalgia, a memory of simpler days filled with TV commercials blasting disco tunes and kids riding banana seat bikes down the street. But in today's world, red dye number 2 remains off limits, exemplifying how food safety regulations evolved from the 1970s onward. Number 5, trans fats in margarine and snacks. Throughout the 1970s, the food industry was big on promoting margarine as a healthier alternative to butter, touting it as better for your heart and easier on the budget. Many families switched over without second thoughts, and baby boomers can recall a time when tubs of bright yellow margarine were everywhere, on tables, in restaurants, and in cooking shows. Old commercials from that era even had catchy jingles about how margarine tastes so much like butter you won't believe it. But the secret behind that texture and taste often lay in partially hydrogenated oils, which are a major source of trans fats. At the time, few people were aware of the potential dangers. Magazines from the 1950s and 1960s painted margarine as a miracle product, and by the 1970s, many home cooks had fully embraced it, using it in baked goods, fried foods, and family dinners. Later research linked trans fats to serious health problems, including heart disease and elevated cholesterol levels. By analyzing various scientific studies, government documents, and industry publications, it's clear the tide started to turn against trans fats in the early 2000s. Over time, regulatory bodies began to recognize the dangers and cracked down. The FDA eventually ruled that partially hydrogenated oils were not generally recognized as safe, leading to a ban that took full effect in the late 2010s. Nowadays, if a product in the US contains any trans fats, it's heavily restricted, and manufacturers often steer clear altogether to avoid legal complications. Older generations who grew up with those stick margarine commercials might remember how it was almost a symbol of modern convenience. No more stubborn butter lumps that were hard to spread on bread. But what once seemed like a perfect solution turned out to have hidden risks. When nostalgia buffs flip through old magazines or watch vintage cooking shows, they'll notice a parade of recipes calling for cups of margarine, with no concern about trans fats. Today, that widespread usage is illegal for most products, marking a massive shift in how Americans approach healthy eating. The story of margarine and trans fats underscores how norms from the 1970s can look shocking in retrospect, reminding us that food trends and regulations continually evolve. Sifting through countless articles and video retrospectives, it's fascinating to see how quickly food laws can change. In the 20th century, especially from the 1930s to the 1980s, people often took government regulations for granted, assuming if something was on the shelf, it must be fine. However, the 1970s was a pivotal period when experts started investigating potential health risks more aggressively. Looking at old commercials from that era, one can see how hard product manufacturers worked to sell new flavors, bright colors, and convenient alternatives. For baby boomers, it all seemed normal. Rock and roll blasted on the radio, folks watched variety shows on those boxy TVs, and families enjoyed whatever was in their local supermarket. Generations later, we look back and realize some foods were removed from the market for good reason. Each of these 5 items, sassafras root beer, Cyclamate sweeteners, real turtle soup, red dye No. 2 candies, and trans fat-laden margarine, tells a story about shifting values and regulations. They connect us to a time when seatbelt laws were looser, smoking ads still appeared on TV, and many Americans thought the future would be all about convenience foods in bright packaging. Across hundreds of online forums, nostalgic social media groups, and YouTube channels dedicated to retro living, there's a treasure trove of memories from that period. People who grew up in the 1970s share stories of rummaging through candy aisles, taste-testing homemade root beer, or remembering that strange but flavorful turtle soup their grandparents prepared. Some hold on to old photo albums showing big family gatherings, set to the backdrop of wood-paneled station wagons, disco-era hairstyles, and Polaroid snapshots of potlucks. It's a way of revisiting a unique chapter in American history, filled with the excitement of new technologies and shifting social norms. That sense of nostalgia makes us appreciate how everyday life has changed, especially when we realize certain foods once seen as ordinary are now off limits. Times have evolved, and so has our understanding of health and safety. In modern America, the government takes a more proactive stance on what can be sold as food. Yet, that doesn't erase the memories baby boomers and Gen Xers hold dear. Even if these items are no longer legal to eat, people still reminisce about them on social media, sometimes trying to recreate safer versions or telling the younger crowd about what we used to eat back in the day. The power of nostalgia is strong, and these old favorites remind us how quickly cultural norms and regulations can shift. Some folks argue that the modern alternatives just don't taste the same, while others point to how many people enjoy longer, healthier lives now. Whether you miss the old flavors or simply view them as a relic of a bygone era, they represent a fascinating piece of America's collective memory tied to the golden age of 20th century pop culture, old Hollywood glamour, and that sense of endless possibility that once defined the 1970s.